Royal Guard breaks 40-year silence, reveals what he witnessed the night before Diana's wedding. Every time the subject of Princess Diana's wedding arose in conversations, on television, or in the papers, he would smile politely, nod, and say nothing. But behind those eyes was a memory so vivid, so impossible to forget, that it haunted him quietly for 40 years. He was a royal guard, one of the few entrusted with the security of Buckingham Palace, and the night before Diana Spencer walked down the aisle to marry Prince Charles, he witnessed something that would remain locked in his heart until now. His life had been one of routine and discipline, a world where the smallest mistake could mean public embarrassment or worse. The palace had its own rhythm, a silent pulse that only those who worked within its walls could understand. Every morning began with precise drills, uniform inspections, and the silent march of guards patrolling the corridors, standing statuesque in their scarlet coats and bearskin hats. To the outside world, it seemed like ceremony and tradition, but for the guards, it was a life of vigilance and quiet observation, a life that demanded they see everything but reveal nothing. He remembered arriving at the palace that day, a crisp spring morning in 1981. The air was charged with anticipation, and the streets outside were alive with crowds, reporters, and photographers eager to capture any glimpse of the soon-to-be princess. But inside the palace walls, everything was still, almost eerily calm. He felt the weight of the uniform pressing against his shoulders, the bearskin hat adding a strange, heavy presence, reminding him of the duty he carried. His boots clicked softly on the polished marble floors, a sound he had learned to measure in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He had seen many events unfold within Buckingham Palace over the years, visiting dignitaries, royal banquets, private ceremonies, but there was something different about this wedding. Diana Spencer was young, radiant, and unknown to the world outside the palace gates, yet everyone inside felt the significance of the moment. It was a turning point, not only for the royal family but for the nation itself. The media frenzy that surrounded the engagement was nothing compared to the hush that filled the palace that night. Guards and staff moved silently through corridors, carrying out tasks with meticulous care. Nothing seemed ordinary, yet everything felt strangely tense. He had always been taught that a royal guard's role was not merely to protect but to observe. Every face, every whispered conversation, every hurried footstep was to be noticed. Yet he was also taught that nothing he saw was to leave the palace. Secrets were not just part of the job, they were the job. And so he had watched quietly as the palace prepared for a wedding that would capture the hearts of millions. There were the flowers, the arrangements, the endless rehearsals. There were the staff members scurrying about, ensuring that every detail, from the placement of silverware to the alignment of chairs, was perfect. It was a world that looked effortless to outsiders, but was anything but. That night, as the palace lights dimmed and the corridors emptied of most of the staff, he was left on his usual patrol route. The halls seemed to stretch endlessly, echoing with his own footsteps. The shadows cast by the chandeliers danced along the walls, and the quiet was almost tangible. He had always found a strange comfort in these moments alone, away from the public eye, where the palace transformed into something almost magical. But this night was different. There was a tension in the air that he could not ignore. Something was happening, something that felt momentous, though he could not yet put it into words. He paused by a doorway, scanning the corridor. His eyes, trained to notice the smallest detail, caught a subtle movement in the distance. He knew the palace well, and he knew that this movement was out of place. He stepped lightly toward the source, his presence unnoticed. What he saw made his heart race and his mind whirl with questions. He could not speak, could not act, yet he knew he had witnessed something extraordinary. It was an ordinary night in the sense that nothing seemed immediately dangerous, yet the moment held a weight that was impossible to explain. For 40 years, he had carried that memory with him. He had told himself countless times that it was better this way, that some truths were not meant to be spoken aloud. Loyalty, duty, and honor had kept his lips sealed. Yet in quiet moments, when he was alone in his home or walking through the empty streets at night, the memory would return, vivid and unyielding. He could see the faces, hear the whispers, and feel the tension in the air as though it had happened yesterday. It was a secret that belonged to the palace, to the royal family, and yet it was also a part of him now, inseparable from who he had become. He often wondered if others had sensed it, if other guards had felt the same tension, had noticed the subtle disturbances in the palace's usually flawless routine. Perhaps they had, but no one spoke. There was an unspoken agreement among those who served the crown. What happened behind these walls stayed behind these walls. And so life went on. The wedding took place, history was made, and the world celebrated the young bride. But for him, the night before remained etched in memory, untouched by time, sacred in its secrecy. Even as the years passed and the world changed outside the palace gates, he remained a silent witness. He watched from the shadows as Diana's life became public property, as the world learned to love her from afar. He observed the joy, the heartbreak, and the tragedies that unfolded, all the while carrying his own silent knowledge. It was a heavy burden, but it was his burden, chosen freely by his sense of duty and loyalty. Now, after 40 years, the time had come to speak, not out of malice or desire for fame, but to share a truth long hidden, to provide a glimpse into a night that history had overlooked. The palace, in its grandeur and elegance, had always been a place of stories untold, of secrets carefully guarded. And he, a humble guard among many, had been one of the few who had witnessed something extraordinary on the eve of a moment that would change the course of history. He remembered the exact moment when he first realized that this memory was different. The palace was quiet, the corridors empty, and he was alone with his thoughts. He had seen things that were never meant to be seen, gestures and conversations that were fleeting yet significant. There was a weight in the air, a tension that he could not explain to anyone at the time. And so he waited, watched, and continued his patrol, knowing that one day, perhaps decades later, he would find the courage to share what he had witnessed. The story he would tell was not about scandal or intrigue in the sensational sense. It was about the human moments behind the pomp and ceremony. It was about the small gestures, the fleeting expressions, and the subtle emotions that went unnoticed by the world, but were profoundly significant to those who saw them. For him, these moments defined the night before the wedding, and they remained etched in his memory, timeless and indelible. As he prepared to finally break his silence, he reflected on his life as a royal guard, the discipline, the loyalty, and the quiet sacrifices. He understood that his story would be met with disbelief, curiosity, and perhaps even skepticism. But he also knew that the truth, no matter how small or hidden, deserved to be told. And so, after 40 years, he chose to step out of the shadows, to share what he had witnessed, and to give the world a glimpse into a night that had remained secret for far too long. Life inside Buckingham Palace was not as glamorous as most people imagined. To the outside world, it looked like a place of glittering balls, royal smiles, and endless pageantry. But for those who worked there, it was a world of discipline, patience, and quiet observation. Every day was a carefully choreographed routine, and the royal guards were at the heart of it. They were not just protectors of the royals, they were witnesses to history, living quietly in the shadows of power. The guard often reflected on how different his life was compared to those who stood outside the palace gates. While the public cheered and celebrated, he and his fellow guards moved silently along polished marble corridors, observing the rhythms of a world most people could only imagine. Every morning, he would polish his boots until they shone, press his uniform so it was perfectly creased, and stand at attention for hours at a time. To some, it might seem like mere showmanship, but for him, it was a discipline, a way of life that demanded respect for tradition, duty, and honor. Inside the palace, there was a hierarchy and an order that extended to every corner of the building. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, from the footmen preparing the rooms to the maids ensuring that every detail of the furnishings was perfect. The kitchens buzzed with activity, yet the sounds were muffled, never breaking the palace's serene silence. The hallways, with their intricate carpets and golden frames, held secrets and stories older than the walls themselves. Every painting, every artifact seemed to carry a memory, and those who walked these corridors were constantly reminded of the palace's history and significance. The guard remembered the day Diana Spencer became engaged to Prince Charles. There had been excitement among the staff, a cautious celebration that reflected both joy and respect. Everyone understood the magnitude of the moment, but there was also a sense of tension. A wedding of this scale required careful planning, secrecy, and complete adherence to protocol. The guards were always aware that even a small misstep could draw attention or disrupt the delicate balance of events. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the palace was transformed. Floral arrangements were meticulously crafted, every flower chosen with precision. Rooms were prepared for the incoming guests, and rehearsal after rehearsal ensured that everything would proceed flawlessly. The guard observed it all, noting the quiet gestures, the soft conversations between staff, the nervous smiles of young footmen, the careful pacing of senior staff overseeing preparations. He had learned over the years that the smallest details often revealed the most about the emotions and intentions of those involved. Even the royal family was different behind the palace walls. To the public, Diana appeared as a radiant young woman, full of charm and poise. But inside the palace, she was also a human being, experiencing the same mixture of excitement, anxiety, and anticipation that anyone would feel before such a life-changing event. The guard saw moments when she laughed quietly with attendants, moments when she paused in reflection, and moments when her smile seemed to carry a hint of uncertainty. These were the kinds of details that never made it into the newspapers, but were unforgettable to those who observed them closely. The guard had always prided himself on his ability to notice what others might overlook. It was a skill developed over years of service, a blend of intuition and careful attention. He understood that behind every ceremonial gesture, every rehearsed smile, there could be a story, a truth waiting to be discovered. That night before the wedding, as the palace quieted down and the corridors emptied of most of the staff, he felt that familiar tension in the air, the feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would remain hidden from the public eye. He moved through the halls with measured steps, aware of every sound, every shadow. The chandeliers cast a soft golden light, illuminating the intricate details of the palace walls. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and flowers, reminders of the preparations that had taken place earlier in the day. Everything seemed calm, almost serene, but he knew better. There was always a layer beneath the surface, a complexity that outsiders could never truly understand. The guard had witnessed many events over the years, visits from foreign dignitaries, state dinners, private audiences, but the night before Diana's wedding was unlike any other. There was a heightened sense of expectation, a mixture of excitement and anxiety that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. He noticed the subtle behaviors of the palace staff, the hurried footsteps of a footman carrying documents, the quiet exchange of instructions between senior attendants, the occasional nervous glance exchanged among the maids. These small movements told a story, one that he understood without needing words. As he patrolled, he reflected on his own role in this intricate world. To some, being a royal guard might seem like a simple job: stand still, follow orders, and present a disciplined appearance. But it was much more than that. Guards were the eyes and ears of the palace, silently witnessing events that would never be recorded in history books. They saw joy, sorrow, tension, and triumph, all within the walls that most people would only ever see in photographs or television broadcasts. The guard had always felt a deep sense of pride in his work. It was a quiet pride, the kind that came from knowing he was part of something larger than himself. Every detail mattered, every moment counted. He understood the importance of discretion and the weight of responsibility that came with being a trusted witness to history. And so he moved through the corridors with care, fully aware that what he saw that night might never be shared, might never be understood by anyone outside these walls. Despite the formal atmosphere, there were moments of human connection that the guard could not ignore. He saw attendants sharing quiet laughter in a hallway, a footman helping a colleague adjust a uniform, and even glimpses of Diana herself, pausing in contemplation. These were small, fleeting moments, yet they carried an authenticity that made the palace feel less like a fortress and more like a home. For the guard, noticing these details was part of his duty, part of what it meant to truly understand life inside Buckingham Palace. The night wore on, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the tension building, an invisible current that ran through the corridors and rooms. Something significant was about to happen, though he could not yet know the full extent of it. As he continued his patrol, his senses remained alert, his mind focused. He understood that history often unfolded quietly, in moments that seemed ordinary at first but carried extraordinary weight upon reflection. The guard had long accepted that his role required patience and discretion. He had learned that the stories he witnessed would not always be recognized, that the significance of events might only be understood years later. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was part of something larger, part of a tradition that had lasted for centuries. Every step he took, every observation he made, was a contribution to the unseen history of the palace. Looking back, he realized that the weeks leading up to the wedding had been a test of endurance, focus, and awareness. The palace was a living, breathing entity, full of movement and energy, and the guards were its silent heartbeat. They were trained to see without interfering, to notice without reacting. It was a delicate balance, and one that required constant vigilance. That night, more than ever, he understood the importance of his role. He remembered the way the corridors felt that evening, unusually still, almost suspended in time. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the faint glow of the chandeliers highlighted the elegance of the palace. He moved carefully, aware that his every step could be witnessed, yet also aware that he was part of a silent dance, a choreography of observation and presence. Every detail mattered, every gesture had meaning, and he was there to witness it all. Even as the palace prepared for a day that would capture the world's attention, he understood that the true significance of this night would remain hidden for decades. The public would see the wedding, the smiles, the flowers, and the grandeur. But the moments he witnessed, the subtle interactions and unspoken emotions, would remain his secret until the time was right. It was a heavy responsibility, but one he carried with unwavering dedication. The life of a royal guard was not glamorous, but it was filled with moments of quiet insight. The guard knew that what he observed in the palace was part of a story that would only be fully understood in hindsight. He had seen events that shaped history, even if they were invisible to the public eye. And as he walked the empty corridors that night, he understood that he was not merely a witness to history, but a guardian of it, entrusted with a secret that was both profound and fragile. In those quiet hours, he reflected on the importance of loyalty, discretion, and awareness. He knew that his observations mattered, that the moments he saw were pieces of a larger story that would unfold in ways he could not yet predict. The palace was alive with history, and he was a part of that living history, carrying memories that would remain with him forever. The night before Princess Diana's wedding was unlike any other the guard had experienced. The palace, usually full of controlled activity and disciplined movement, seemed to hum with a quiet tension. It was as if the walls themselves knew that something historic was about to happen. Even the corridors, which usually echoed with the soft rhythm of footsteps, now felt alive with anticipation, carrying an invisible charge that he could feel with every step. He had completed his final patrol of the evening, walking the familiar hallways, checking doors and entrances, and ensuring that everything was in perfect order. He knew the palace like the back of his hand. Every corner, every shadow, every polished surface was familiar to him. Yet that night, even the familiar felt different. The usual calm that settled over Buckingham Palace at night was replaced by an almost electric sense of expectation. There was an awareness in the air, subtle but undeniable, that the next day would change not only the lives of those directly involved, but also the world outside. As he continued his silent rounds, he passed by rooms that had been prepared for the royal family and guests. He caught glimpses of flowers carefully arranged, shining silverware, and folded linens that were placed with meticulous precision. He noticed the faint smell of fresh paint and polished wood, reminders of the preparations that had been carried out for weeks. Every detail mattered, and the palace staff had done their best to ensure that everything was flawless. To him, these details were not just about appearances. They were about the pride, the effort, and the devotion that went into making the wedding a perfect event. But amid the beauty and the preparation, there was also a sense of something hidden, a quiet moment of tension that he could not ignore. He had walked these corridors countless times, but that night, he noticed the subtle movements of people in a way that was different. Staff whispered quietly in the corners, their voices barely audible over the polished floors, soft echoes. Some paused in hallways, exchanging nervous glances or small smiles that hinted at secrets they could not share. The guard understood immediately that these were more than simple gestures. They were signals of the emotions running just below the surface, emotions that the world outside would never see. He paused outside one of the private chambers, listening carefully. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Inside, he could hear faint voices, the kind of hushed, careful conversation that happens when people are aware they are being observed. He could not make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Anticipation, nerves, and the unspoken weight of responsibility. He remained where he was, as trained, invisible yet vigilant, absorbing the scene with a sense of solemn respect. The guard's eyes moved to the grand staircase, its polished rails gleaming softly in the light. It had been a focal point of the palace for centuries, a symbol of elegance and tradition. He knew that tomorrow countless eyes would watch Diana descend this staircase, capturing a moment that would be remembered forever. But tonight, it stood quietly, holding a stillness that seemed almost sacred. He felt a strange mix of awe and responsibility, realizing that he was not just a guard but a silent witness to history, standing guard over a night that few would ever know in its true form. As he continued his patrol, he entered the West Wing, where the staff were making last-minute preparations. A footman was adjusting a rug, moving it slightly to ensure it was perfectly aligned. A maid carefully polished the handles of a silver tray, her movements precise and deliberate. Every action, no matter how small, carried significance. The guard watched, noting the concentration and dedication in their faces. These moments of care, these small acts of service, were part of what made the palace function like a living organism. Each person had a role, and every detail contributed to the grand event that would unfold the next day. Then, as he moved past a long corridor, he noticed something unusual. A door, normally locked at this hour, was slightly ajar. It was a subtle deviation from the strict protocols of the palace, and immediately his instincts told him that this was a moment worth observing. He approached slowly, careful not to draw attention. Inside, he glimpsed a scene that he would never forget, a scene that would remain etched in his memory for decades. He saw Diana Spencer, the future princess, standing quietly, her expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was alone for a brief moment, away from the eyes of the staff and the public, taking in the reality of what was about to happen. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a piece of her attire, a small gesture that revealed the humanity behind the public image. The guard observed respectfully, knowing that this was not a moment for intrusion, but for silent witnessing. It was a private moment of reflection, one that would be invisible to the cameras, yet profoundly human. Nearby, members of the staff moved with quiet efficiency, giving Diana space while still performing their duties. The balance of presence and absence was delicate, and the guard understood it intuitively. He saw the unspoken communication between Diana and those around her, a nod, a gentle smile, a reassuring touch on the shoulder. These small, fleeting gestures carried enormous meaning, and he recognized them as part of the preparation that went beyond ceremony. They were acts of support, comfort, and understanding in a moment charged with emotion. He continued to observe as Diana moved slowly through the room, taking a deep breath and straightening her posture. The guard noticed her gaze linger on the mirror, as if seeing herself not just as a young woman about to marry a prince, but as someone stepping into a role that would transform her life forever. He felt a mixture of admiration and empathy, understanding that behind the glamour and expectation lay vulnerability and courage. This was a side of Diana that the world rarely saw, a private, unguarded moment that revealed her strength and humanity. As he moved to a nearby hallway, he became aware of another presence, a senior palace official quietly checking on the arrangements, ensuring that everything was perfect. Their movements were careful, deliberate, and respectful. The guard could sense the shared understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that tonight was a night of importance, a night that would remain in memory long after it had passed. He continued his patrol with heightened awareness, recognizing that he was part of a delicate balance between observation and discretion, between presence and invisibility. Time seemed to stretch as the night progressed. The palace, usually a place of strict routine, felt alive with anticipation. Every sound, every movement, every shadow carried significance. The guard remained vigilant, fully aware that he was witnessing a unique moment in history. He saw the subtle interactions, the small adjustments, the fleeting expressions of those around him. Each detail added depth to his understanding of the palace as a living, breathing entity, full of life, emotion, and human connection. He remembered pausing by a window, looking out over the quiet palace gardens. The moon cast a gentle glow over the grounds, illuminating the paths and hedges with a soft, silver light. It was a moment of calm in the midst of anticipation, a moment that allowed him to reflect on the significance of what he had witnessed. The palace, with its grandeur and history, seemed almost timeless in that soft light, a silent witness itself to the events unfolding within its walls. And then in a quiet corridor near the private chambers, he saw it, a small, fleeting interaction that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He observed Diana Spencer, her expression thoughtful and composed, speaking softly with a member of the staff. The conversation was private, yet full of meaning, a mix of reassurance, guidance, and human connection. The guard watched, understanding that these moments were not meant for the public eye, yet they revealed the depth of care, emotion, and preparation that went into the wedding. He remained there for a while, fully absorbing the scene, knowing that this night would forever be a part of his memory. The details, the gestures, the emotions, everything was vivid and unforgettable. He understood that he was not just witnessing history, but participating in it in a silent, unobtrusive way. His role as a royal guard had prepared him for this moment, teaching him the importance of observation, discretion, and respect. As the hours passed, the palace gradually grew quieter. The staff retreated to their own quarters, leaving Diana and a few close attendants in the private chambers. The guard continued his rounds, ensuring that everything remained secure, yet fully aware of the significance of what he had witnessed. The night before the wedding was a tapestry of subtle moments, human gestures, and quiet anticipation, a tapestry that he had the rare privilege of observing. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the palace walls, the guard had completed his patrol. He paused for a moment, reflecting on the night he had just witnessed. It had been a night filled with subtle drama, quiet emotion, and the extraordinary humanity behind the public spectacle. For 40 years, he would carry this memory with him, a secret woven into the fabric of his life, a testament to the unseen moments that shape history. Even as the days, months, and years passed, the memory of that night remained vivid in the guard's mind. The wedding went ahead as the world watched in awe, with glittering gowns, sparkling jewelry, and endless smiles captured by cameras around the globe. To the public, it was a fairy tale come to life, a moment of joy, elegance, and hope. But for the guard, that night before the wedding held a depth and intensity that the world would never know. It was a private reality, one that he carried silently, tucked away behind the discipline and routine of his life. He often reflected on how it felt to witness something so extraordinary, yet remain powerless to share it. He had always known that his role as a royal guard demanded discretion, but the weight of that secrecy became heavier as the years went by. He saw headlines, interviews, and documentaries about Diana, about the wedding, and about the royal family. Each piece of news reminded him of the contrast between the public narrative and the private truth he had seen. And each time he felt the old tension stir within him, the mix of loyalty, duty, and the longing to finally speak. The guard's life was structured around observation, and yet there were moments when the structure itself felt constraining. He would walk through the streets, pass Buckingham Palace, and see tourists posing for photographs, entirely unaware of the layers of life happening within the walls. Inside, he had seen vulnerability, uncertainty, and human emotion that no camera could capture. He remembered the soft, nervous gestures of Diana, the quiet reassurances exchanged among the staff, and the subtle expressions that revealed more than words ever could. These memories stayed with him, etched deeply into his consciousness, reminders of the responsibility he had borne silently. He realized that carrying such a secret shaped his perspective on loyalty and duty. The world often saw the uniform, the ceremonial precision, and the outward calm of the guards. They admired the dedication, the discipline, and the quiet presence. But few understood that beneath the uniform lay a human being with emotions, reflections, and struggles of their own. To carry a secret meant living with a part of life that no one else could share, and to guard it faithfully meant accepting the isolation that came with it. In the years that followed, he noticed how the memory occasionally surfaced in the most unexpected moments. A song on the radio, A photograph in the paper or a television clip of the royal family could bring him back to that quiet night before the wedding. He would close his eyes and see the same dimly lit corridors, the subtle gestures, and the private moments he had observed. Sometimes he felt pride in having been a witness, knowing that history had unfolded with grace and dignity. At other times, he felt a pang of frustration, longing to share what he knew but understanding the consequences of breaking protocol. There were nights when the weight of the secret felt particularly heavy. Alone in his home, he would sit quietly, replaying the scene in his mind, remembering the expressions, the whispered words, and the atmosphere of anticipation. He thought about Diana, about the staff, and about the palace itself, and he realized how deeply those moments had touched him. The emotions were subtle but profound, and he understood that part of his life had been forever intertwined with a private history that no one else would ever know. Yet, despite the silence, he found ways to honor the memory. He carried the lessons of observation, patience, and discretion into every aspect of his life. He treated others with a heightened awareness, noticing small gestures and unspoken emotions. He learned to appreciate the beauty of fleeting moments, the quiet connections that often go unnoticed, and the subtle ways in which people communicate beyond words. His life outside the palace, though ordinary in appearance, was enriched by the extraordinary insight he had gained from that night. Over time, he also began to understand the nature of secrets and their impact on the human psyche. A secret like the one he carried was not simply information. It was a responsibility, a moral and emotional weight that influenced decisions, behaviors, and relationships. He recognized that the discipline required to maintain silence was not only professional, but also deeply personal. It shaped his character, taught him resilience, and instilled a profound respect for the lives and experiences of others. He occasionally shared fragments of his experiences with close friends, but even then he was careful. The details had to remain vague, the moments generalized, so that the essence of his observations could be conveyed without violating the sacred trust he had held for decades. His friends sensed the significance of what he had seen, but even they did not fully understand the depth of the memory or the emotions tied to it. It was a loneliness born not of isolation, but of responsibility, a loneliness he accepted willingly because he believed in the importance of discretion. The guard also observed how the world's perception of Diana evolved over the years. The public adored her charm, her kindness, and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. But the guard knew there was more beneath the surface, the humanity, the vulnerability, and the courage that she displayed in private moments. His memories allowed him to see a fuller picture, one that contrasted with the simplified narrative presented in the media. And in seeing that contrast, he recognized the importance of truth, even when it remained hidden, and the value of moments that might never be celebrated but are nonetheless significant. There were times when he wondered whether it was right to keep the secret. Could sharing it bring clarity, appreciation, or understanding? Or would it betray the trust of those who had been part of that night? The questions lingered unanswered for decades. Yet he also knew that timing was crucial, and that truth revealed too early or too casually could cause harm. Patience, he realized, was not only a professional requirement but a moral one. Waiting for the right moment became part of the burden he carried, a test of character and endurance. As the years passed, he retired from his duties as a royal guard, but the palace continued to hold a part of him. He carried the memories into his everyday life, into quiet walks, into conversations with family, and into moments of reflection. The secret was no longer tied to his professional responsibilities, but had become an intrinsic part of his identity. He understood that some experiences, particularly those witnessed in the unique environment of Buckingham Palace, could never be fully shared or understood by others. And yet, they shaped him in ways both profound and subtle. He also thought about the role of observation in his own life. The palace had taught him to see beyond the surface, to notice details that others overlooked, and to appreciate the small gestures that reveal human emotion. That skill, honed over decades, became a part of his personal philosophy. He applied it in interactions with family, friends, and even strangers, recognizing that everyone carries unseen struggles, quiet joys, and unspoken stories. The memory of that night before the wedding, and the emotions he witnessed, became a lens through which he viewed the world, a lens of empathy, understanding, and respect. Despite the passage of time, he felt a sense of urgency growing within him. The decades of silence had preserved the memory, but he realized that memories fade, details blur, and opportunities for truth can be lost forever. The world had changed, the royal family had experienced triumphs and tragedies, and the public's fascination with Diana remained as strong as ever. He knew that if the story was to be told, it had to be done with care, accuracy, and respect. It was not about sensationalism or fame. It was about sharing a human moment, a glimpse behind the scenes of history, and honoring the people who lived it. He reflected on the lessons he had learned from carrying the secret, the importance of patience, the weight of responsibility, and the quiet courage required to maintain loyalty. He understood that the story he held was not only about what he had seen, but about the deeper truths of life inside the palace, about human emotion, connection, and the complexity of roles and relationships that rarely make it into public view. These were the lessons that guided him, even as he lived a life outside the palace, removed from the grandeur and history that had defined his earlier years. And so, after 40 years of silence, he reached a point where he knew it was time. Not out of impulse or desire for recognition, but out of a belief that truth, even hidden, has value. The world deserved to hear a glimpse of the reality behind the spectacle, to understand the humanity that exists in private moments, and to appreciate the lives of those who contribute quietly to history. He carried the memory with reverence, ready to share it with the world in a way that honored both his duty and the people he had observed so closely. The guard's story was one of patience, loyalty, and quiet courage. It was about living with a secret that shaped him, about understanding the weight of discretion, and about recognizing the human moments that exist behind the public eye. It was a story that demonstrated the complexity of life inside Buckingham Palace and the unseen roles that make history possible. And now, after decades of reflection, he was ready to share it, offering the world a window into a night that had remained private for far too long. After 40 years of silence, the guard finally decided that the time had come to speak. The decision was not made lightly. It was the result of decades of reflection, careful consideration, and the deep understanding that some truths, while hidden for good reason, carry their own importance. This was not a tale of scandal or intrigue. It was a story of human moments, subtle gestures, and quiet truths that shaped the night before one of the most famous weddings in history. He chose a quiet afternoon to speak with a trusted journalist, someone who he believed would treat the story with respect and integrity. He remembered sitting across the table, hands folded, heart beating faster than it had in decades. It was strange, even unsettling, to feel the weight of anticipation reversed. After years of observing history in silence, he was about to become a part of it in a different way. The memories that had been so private, so vivid, began to surface, ready to be shared with the world. He began by recounting the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace in those days. He spoke of the disciplined routines, the quiet movements of staff, and the sense of anticipation that filled every corridor. He described the palace not merely as a building, but as a living entity, full of history, tradition, and human emotion. He painted a picture of a world that few would ever see, a world where every detail mattered and where every small gesture carried significance. Then he moved to the night before the wedding, the night that had haunted him and stayed with him all these years. He spoke of the quiet corridors, dimly lit by chandeliers that cast long shadows on the walls. He recalled the soft sounds of footsteps, the faint whispers of staff performing their duties, and the subtle tension in the air. To the world, it might have seemed like an ordinary night, but for those inside the palace, it was a night heavy with emotion and anticipation. He described Diana Spencer in those private moments. She was not the global icon that the world had come to know, but a young woman experiencing excitement, nerves, and the weight of a life-changing decision. The guard spoke of her gentle gestures, the small adjustments to her attire, and the moments of quiet reflection as she prepared to step into the public eye. These were human moments, deeply private and profoundly significant, moments that the public had never witnessed but that defined the night. He spoke of the staff, too, the attendants, footmen, and maids who worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. He recalled the small interactions, the supportive gestures, and the shared understanding that this was a night of importance. Each action, no matter how minor it seemed, was part of a carefully orchestrated effort to support Diana and the royal family. The guard emphasized the humanity in these moments, the kindness, patience, and dedication that went unnoticed by the outside world. As he recounted the events, he reflected on the weight of his own role. He had been a silent observer, a guardian not only of the palace but also of its secrets. He had watched, he had noticed, and he had understood, yet he had spoken to no one. The burden of secrecy had shaped his life, influencing his thoughts, behaviors, and perspective. He spoke of the internal struggle, knowing that the world would never see what he had witnessed, yet understanding the importance of discretion and loyalty. The journalist listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions, but always with respect. They understood that this was more than a story. It was a revelation of human experience, of history observed from within. The guard appreciated their sensitivity, recognizing that the story would only be meaningful if told with care. He wanted the world to understand the truth, not for sensationalism, but to honor the people who lived through that night. The staff, Diana, and everyone who played a part in the quiet, unseen moments that made history possible. When he reached the moment that had remained most vivid in his memory, he paused. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He described a fleeting interaction between Diana and a member of the staff, a private exchange of reassurance and guidance that was never meant to be public. The simplicity of the moment, the human connection it revealed, stayed with him for decades. It was a reminder that history is not only made in grand gestures, but also in quiet acts of care, courage, and understanding. He spoke of his own feelings during that night, the awe, the respect, and the profound awareness of witnessing something extraordinary. He remembered the tension in the air, the anticipation, and the subtle gestures that communicated more than words ever could. He had observed these moments with the knowledge that they would remain private, yet he carried them as a gift, a memory that defined a part of his life and shaped his understanding of human experience. Breaking his silence after 40 years brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. For decades, he had carried the weight of discretion, but now, sharing the story offered a sense of closure. He realized that the world could finally glimpse a part of history that had remained hidden, a window into the palace that went beyond public ceremonies and media coverage. He hoped that this revelation would allow people to see Diana not only as a global icon, but as a human being, and to understand the quiet dedication of those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The journalist asked how he had managed to keep the secret for so long. He smiled faintly, reflecting on the years of training, discipline, and understanding that being a royal guard had instilled in him. It was a combination of loyalty, responsibility, and respect for those he served. He had accepted that some stories were meant to remain unseen, that discretion was not only a professional requirement, but also a moral obligation. The decision to speak now was made carefully, with the understanding that the story could be told respectfully and meaningfully. As the interview continued, he shared the lessons he had learned from carrying this secret. He spoke of patience, the importance of observation, and the quiet courage it takes to remain loyal while bearing the weight of knowledge. He reflected on the humanity he had witnessed, the private moments of emotion and care, and the dedication of everyone involved in making the wedding a success. These were the truths that history often overlooks, but they were just as important as the grand public events. He emphasized that the story was not about sensational details, but about understanding the human experience behind the spectacle. He wanted people to see that even in a world of grandeur and ceremony, there were quiet moments of connection, gestures of kindness, and emotions that mattered deeply. These were the threads that wove the fabric of history, and for 40 years he had been a silent witness to them. When the story was finally published, it resonated with people around the world. Readers were fascinated not by scandal or controversy, but by the human moments that the guard had observed. They appreciated the insight into the palace as a living, breathing world, full of emotion, dedication, and subtle truths. The revelation brought a new understanding of Diana, not as a distant figure in history, but as a young woman experiencing a life-changing moment with grace, vulnerability, and humanity. The guard received messages of gratitude and admiration from readers who recognized the courage it took to share such a story. They were moved by the way he honored the memory of those who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes and by his careful, respectful storytelling. It was a reminder that history is not only written in newspapers and official accounts, but also in the memories of those who quietly witness it, preserving the truth in ways that are invisible yet profoundly significant. Reflecting on the aftermath, the guard felt a deep sense of relief and fulfillment. The decades of silence had been heavy, but now the story was out, and the world could appreciate the humanity, emotion, and dedication that he had witnessed. He realized that sharing the story did not diminish his loyalty or respect. Instead, it honored the very principles that had guided him for so long. It was a celebration of discretion, observation, and the quiet courage that defines those who serve faithfully in unseen roles. He continued to speak about the night before Diana's wedding with care, always mindful of the sensitivity of the details. Yet, he also spoke with pride, knowing that his story offered a rare glimpse into history from the perspective of someone who had truly seen it unfold. He emphasized that it was a story about people, about relationships, and about the moments that make history meaningful. It was a story of humanity, not spectacle, a story that finally, after 40 years, could be told. And so, the guard's revelation became a part of the broader narrative of Diana's life and legacy. It added depth, nuance, and humanity to a story that the world had watched unfold for decades. It reminded people that behind the grandeur of history are quiet, unseen moments, observed and preserved by those who serve faithfully. For the guard, the act of speaking was not just about sharing a memory. It was about honoring the past, recognizing the courage of others, and acknowledging the profound importance of human connection. In the end, the story was a testament to patience, loyalty, and the enduring power of truth. It demonstrated that even in worlds filled with ceremony and tradition, the most meaningful moments are often quiet, human, and deeply personal. The guard had waited 40 years to tell his story, and in doing so, he reminded the world that history is not only what is seen by millions, but also what is quietly witnessed, cherished, and remembered by those who live it in silence.